So picture this. It's 1980, and there's a philosopher sitting in a prison cell in Iraq.
Right. Under horrific circumstances, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. But what's he doing? He's actually using modern probability calculus to try and mathematically prove the existence of God.
It's such an incredible moment in intellectual
It
history.
really is. He's tackling David Hume's problem of induction head on.
Right.
And he's doing it using the absolute strictest terms of modern analytic philosophy.
Yeah, and entirely devoid of any religious scripture, which is the wild part. He's just using pure logic and math,
And he finalized this massive work just shortly before he was executed.
which is tragic, but it also highlights how he wasn't just operating in a vacuum. He was the culmination of a continuous, highly rigorous philosophical tradition.
A tradition that stretches back well over 1,000 years.
Exactly, and it's a tradition that, if you read most Western textbooks, supposedly died 8 centuries earlier.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're taking you on this epic, really scholarly exploration of a monumental source text. It's called the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Philosophy.
Edited by Khaled El Rouaihab and Sabine Shemetja.
Right. And the mission for you today is pretty huge. We're going to completely dismantle one of the most stubborn historical misconceptions out there.
Oh, it is colossal. It's a misconception that has basically dominated how we view global intellectual history for, the better part of a century.
Yeah, and this handbook systematically tears it down. Not with generalizations, but by really digging into the highly technical text that changed how humanity understands existence.
And logic and the cosmos and epistemology, it's all in there.
So if you've ever taken like a standard philosophy 101 class,
Yeah.
you were probably handed a timeline, right? And it looked like a very clean, well-organized relay race.
Yeah, the classic relay race narrative.
The story goes, the ancient Greeks invented philosophy. Then the Roman Empire falls, Europe plunges into the Dark Ages.
Right. And during this time, according to the myth, Islamic scholars just acted as the world's most diligent librarians.
Exactly. They translated the Greek texts, held onto them for safekeeping, and then around the 12th century, they kindly handed those texts back to the Latin West.
And then they just stopped. That's what we were all taught.
They just packed it up.
Right. The assumption was that Orthodox Islamic theology essentially stamped out all rational inquiry.
So the whole Islamic world just sank into this filious darkness where blind faith completely replaced reason.
Which is such a wild assumption if you actually pause to think about it for even a second.
I know, right? The idea that an entire civilization spanning multiple continents just collectively decided, you know what, we're done thinking critically.
Let's just wrap it up. It's absurd. But that was the dominant narrative for so long.
Well, this deep dive is going to prove to you that philosophy never died in the Islamic world. It didn't even go dormant.
No, it evolved, it disguised itself, and it thrived continuously.
Without a single break, from the 9th century all the way into the 20th century.
We are literally looking at over 1,000 years of unbroken intellectual history here.
It's mind-blowing. We're going to explore desert islands where philosophers imagine human reason developing in total isolation.
We're going to examine how ancient scholars mapped out the metaphysical implications of the word one.
And we'll dig into how 20th century thinkers reconciled ancient theology with Newtonian thermodynamics.
It's a massive journey.
But before we get to the probability calculus and thermodynamics, we really need to figure out how this massive relay race myth got started in the first place.
Yeah, that's the foundational question.
Like, if all these incredible thinkers were still doing highly technical philosophy for another 800 years past the supposed deadline, why did the rest of the world think it died?
Well, the narrative of its death primarily stems from early 20th century Orientalist scholarship.
Okay, who are we talking about here?
So if you look at influential figures like T.J. de Boer writing around 1901 or W. Montgomery Watt in the 1960s, they really promoted this idea.
That Orthodox theologians just killed the tradition.
Exactly. They pointed to specific theological critiques from the 11th and 12th centuries and just concluded that philosophy was formally repudiated.
But then in the 1960s, a paradigm shift finally started to happen, right? Scholars started looking closer at the actual texts.
They did. You had these pioneering scholars, people like Henry Corbin, say Hossein Nasr, and Nicholas Rescher.
And they started to push back.
Yeah, they began to seriously question the death of philosophy narrative. Corbin and Nasr, in particular, looked toward Iran.
Oh, okay. What did they find in Iran?
Well, through a series of really groundbreaking studies, they proved that the philosophical tradition actually continued without interruption in Shia Iranian circles.
All the way down to the modern period.
Exactly.
So what kind of philosophy were they finding? Was it just like a carbon copy of Aristotle?
Not at all. It was completely different. They highlighted this anti-peripatetic, heavily Platonist movement called Illuminationism.
Which we're definitely going to explore later.
Yes, and they also found these massive mystical syntheses from the 17th century. They proved deep metaphysical thinking was absolutely still happening.
And meanwhile, Nicholas Riescher was looking at logic, right?
Right. Riescher was proving that Arabic works on formal logic were incredibly vigorous and sophisticated well into the 13th and 14th centuries.
So in the 60s, the academic world realizes, wait, it didn't die. It just moved to Iran and became heavily mystical, and people were still doing logic.
That was the new consensus, yeah.
But our source text today, the Handbook, pushes back even on that correction, doesn't it?
It does, aggressively. The Handbook argues that while Corbin and Nasser were groundbreaking, the picture they painted was still way too narrow.
Because they focus too much on Iran.
Exactly. They unduly stressed the Platonist, mystical Shia synthesis. And by doing that, they inadvertently ignored everything else.
Like the rigorous physics and natural philosophy happening elsewhere.
Right. Recent scholarship by figures like Dmitry Gudas, A.I. Sabra, and Rob Wisnowski has proven that philosophy survived and thrived in the majority Sunni Islamic world as well.
So the supposed demise of philosophy in the Sunni world is just as much of a myth.
A total myth.
Okay, but I am stuck on a really basic logical problem here.
Lay it on me.
If you have scholars in Egypt, in India, in the Ottoman Empire, all still doing highly technical, rigorous philosophy for centuries, how could the entire academic establishment just miss it?
It's a great question.
Do they just, stop calling it philosophy?
In a word, yes, that is exactly what happened, and this is the absolute crux of the misunderstanding.
Wait, really? The word just changed.
Yeah, the Arabic word for philosophy, falsafa, became highly stigmatized.
But why? What did the word falsafa actually mean to them at that time?
Well, it didn't just mean love of wisdom or critical thinking like we think of it today. In the classical Islamic context, the term falsafa became inextricably linked to a very specific set of views.
Like controversial views.
Highly controversial cosmological views. These were held by the early philosophers who heavily embraced Aristotle and Neoplatonism. Mainstream religious scholars deemed these specific views heretical.
Okay, I need specifics. What kind of views are we talking about here?
There were three massive sticking points. The first was the eternity of the world.
Meaning the universe has just always been here.
Right. The philosophers, following Aristotle, argued that the universe had no beginning in time. It was just an eternal emanation from God.
But mainstream theology didn't like that.
Not at all. Mainstream theology insisted on a creation ex nihilo, meaning a creation from nothing at a very specific point in time.
Right, because if the universe has always existed alongside God, it implies God isn't a creator who makes a free choice to create.
Exactly. It makes God just a static cause of an eternal effect.
I can see why the theologians hated that. What was the second issue?
The second issue was the claim that God only knows universals and not the tiny changing particulars of our everyday lives.
Wait, so God knows what a human is,
Yeah.
but doesn't know what I had for breakfast?
That's a perfect way to put it, yeah. The philosophers thought it was beneath the dignity of a perfect, unchanging God to have his knowledge constantly changing as human events unfold.
Wow. Okay, and the third issue?
The third was the denial of bodily resurrection. The philosophers believed only the immaterial soul survives death, completely rejecting the literal physical resurrection described in Scripture.
Ah, I see. So if you walked around in the 13th century calling yourself a philosopher, you weren't saying, I'm a critical thinker.
No, you were broadcasting a very specific theological stance.
You were essentially saying, I believe the universe is eternal, God doesn't know what you ate today, and your body is going to rot forever.
Precisely. And because the word falsafa was associated with those specific condemned commitments, later scholars naturally avoided the label.
But they didn't abandon the tools of rational inquiry.
Not at all. Philosophy simply rebranded. It was absorbed into kalam, which is Islamic theology.
So they just smuggled it in under a new name.
Essentially, yes. The tools of Greek logic, epistemology, and metaphysics were taken into the madrasas, the traditional religious colleges. They just utilized them under a different umbrella.
Think about it like a modern software engineer, Imagine someone who writes brilliant, highly complex code for massive networks.
Okay.
But they absolutely refuse to call themselves a hacker, because the word hacker has all this baggage about stealing credit card numbers and breaking into mainframes.
That's a really good analogy.
They'd say, I am absolutely not a hacker. I am a systems architect. The title changed, the ethical framework changed, but the fundamental underlying mechanics are still happening.
The coding and the logic are identical, yes.
These post-12th century scholars were refusing the title of philosophe, but they were still using Aristotelian categories to debate space, time, and existence itself.
When you look at widely studied handbooks of theology from the 14th century, you find them dedicating hundreds of pages to thoroughly rational discussions on essence and existence.
Which is just philosophy.
It is. They were doing philosophy in the modern analytic sense of the word. They just weren't calling it falsafa.
And because Western historians were only looking for books with the actual word philosophy on the cover, they thought the tradition had vanished.
They completely missed it.
That is wild. So to really understand how philosophy managed to sneak its way into theology and rebrand itself so successfully, we have to look at the DNA of the philosophy they were working with.
We have to go back to the foundational era.
Let's travel back to the 9th and 10th centuries. Set the scene for us.
Okay, so it's a fascinating period. The Abbasid Caliphate is in power. The translation movement is in full swing in Baghdad.
Greek texts are being translated into Arabic at a staggering rate.
A massive rate. But there is a very curious text from this era that our sources highlight, which fundamentally altered the trajectory of all Islamic thought.
It's called the Theology of Aristotle. But this is one of my favorite historical mix-ups of all time.
Because the book wasn't by Aristotle at all.
Not even close.
No, the pseudo-theology of Aristotle, as it's known today, was actually a translated, heavily edited compilation of writings by Plotinus.
Specifically parts of his Enneads, right?
Exactly, Enneads the 4th through 6th.
And for anyone listening who needs a quick refresher, Plotinus and Aristotle are worlds apart.
Entirely different universes of thought. Aristotle is highly empirical, logical, focused on biology, physics, categorization.
He's the guy with the very detached, unmoved mover.
Right, but Plotinus, on the other hand, was a Neoplatonist. His philosophy is heavily focused on the mystical emanation of the universe from a totally transcendent one.
He writes about the descent of the soul into the physical body and how to purify it.
Very mystical stuff. But the early Islamic scholars didn't know it was Plotinus.
They thought they were reading the ultimate crowning theological work of Aristotle himself.
Yes, they had the real works of Aristotle, the physics, the logic, but then they had the pseudo-theology, which was deeply mystical.
So they just naturally assumed it was all part of one cohesive system.
They did. This meant that early Islamic philosophy was, from its very genesis, an attempt to synthesize Aristotelian logic with Neoplatonic metaphysics.
They were trying to build a bridge between the physical mechanics of the world and a deeply mystical view of God.
Which sets the stage perfectly for Al-Kindi.
Ah, Al-Kindi. He dies around 873, and he's widely known as the first philosopher of the Arabs.
And when you read his major work on first philosophy, it's fascinating.
It feels less like a dry academic text and more like an aggressive public relations campaign for Greek thought.
He was definitely operating as an intellectual ambassador. I mean, he's writing for a society deeply grounded in prophetic revelation. The Quran is the ultimate truth.
And his core mission seems to be convincing his contemporaries that Greek philosophical thought and Islamic revelation are saying the exact same thing.
Right. He defends philosophy as the science of the first cause, which is really just his way of saying that the study of metaphysics is fundamentally the study of God.
But how does he actually bridge that gap? Because a Greek first cause isn't exactly the personal speaking God of the Quran.
He bridges it through a very specific branch of metaphysics called henology.
Henology being the study of the one.
Correct. Al-Kindi builds a tight philosophical argument to show that the true one, which in Neoplatonism is the cause of all existence, is identical to the absolutely transcendent God of Islamic theology.
And to do this, he literally had to invent a new philosophical vocabulary in Arabic, didn't he?
He did. He wrestled with how to translate Greek concepts of being and essence into a language that didn't have direct equivalents.
He comes up with terms like inyaya and huwiya, right? Let's break those down.
Sure. Understanding these terms unlocks how he was thinking. Inya comes from the Arabic particle inna, which means that or indeed.
So how did he use it?
He used it to try and capture the concept of being or the simple fact that something exists.
Okay, and huwiya?
Huwiya comes from the Arabic pronoun huwa, meaning he.
So huwiya literally translates to something like he-ness.
Exactly. Yeesness, or identity, he is trying to articulate the specific, unique essence of a thing.
So by forging these new terms, Al-Kindi is trying to prove, purely through logic, that God is the absolute true one.
Yes. Created things are always a mixture of unity and multiplicity. Like, you are one person, but you have many parts, arms, legs, thoughts, a past, a future.
But God, the true one, possesses no multiplicity whatsoever.
Completely indivisible.
It's a brilliant way of taking the Islamic insistence on the absolute oneness of God Tawhid and mapping it perfectly onto Greek metaphysics.
It was a genius move, but the intellectual scene back then wasn't a monolith.
Right, you had Al-Kindi acting as the diplomat, but you also had figures who were radically expanding the field into far more controversial areas.
A prime example is Abu Bakr al-Razi, who dies in 925.
Now, he is widely celebrated as one of the greatest physicians of the medieval period, right?
Yes, but philosophically, he was a massive outlier. He wrote a text called The Spiritual Medicine.
And what makes him such a controversial outlier is that he actually rejected the necessity of prophetic revelation entirely.
He did. Al-Razi believed that human reason alone was entirely sufficient for moral and spiritual guidance. He didn't think we needed prophets.
Wow, in that era, that's a huge claim.
It was. In The Spiritual Medicine, he views philosophy as a kind of therapy for the soul. He provides highly rational methods for curing negative character traits, like anger or greed, purely through self-discipline.
So you've got Al-Kindi the diplomat, Al-Razi the rationalist rebel, but the person who actually sits down and builds the rigorous foundation everyone else will use for a millennium is Al-Farabi.
Al-Farabi is the architect. He dies in 950, and he is known in the tradition as the second teacher.
Second only to Aristotle.
Exactly. If Al-Kindi introduced henology, Al-Farabi turned it into a microscopic science. We really see this in his treatise on the one and oneness.
When you look at Al-Farabi's work on this, it is almost dizzying. He spends an enormous amount of time just disentangling every conceivable meaning of the word one.
Because for Al-Farabi, precision is everything. He categorizes the different senses in which we can call something one.
Like what?
Well, he identifies the one in genus. For example, a human and a horse are both one in the sense that they share the genus of animal.
Okay, that makes sense.
He identifies the one in species like two different individual humans. He talks about the one in continuity, like a single, unbroken line.
The one in substrate, the one in number. But if I'm listening to this, I am probably wondering, why does he care so much about this?
It sounds pedantic, right?
Yeah. Why go to such excruciating lengths to define the word one? What are the stakes here?
The stakes are literally the entire mechanism of the universe.
How so?
In the Neoplatonic and Aristotelian systems they were working with, there is a fundamental rule. From the pure one, only one can proceed.
So if God is absolutely indivisibly one, how do we get a universe filled with billions of messy things?
Exactly. To understand how multiplicity emanates from the first cause, you have to understand the exact nature of the first cause's unity versus the unity of a rock.
Al-Farabi is providing the semantic and logical scaffolding to explain the mechanics of creation itself.
He built the framework.
And that scaffolding leads us to the most consequential figure in this entire history.
Yeah.
Al-Farabi built the framework, but it was Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, who built the empire.
That is the perfect transition. Avicenna, who dies in 1037, is the absolute titan of the Islamic intellectual tradition.
His philosophical system just became the gravitational center of all subsequent thought.
For the next 800 years, you either agreed with Avicenna or you defined your entire philosophy by how you disagreed with him.
The Handbook dives deep into the metaphysical section of his massive encyclopedia, the Book of Healing the Shifa.
And the text points out that Avicenna structures his entire metaphysics around three main poles.
Let's walk through those poles to understand how his mind worked. What's the first one?
The first is the epistemological pole. Before you can study metaphysics, you have to define what metaphysics actually is. Avicenna argues that the subject matter of metaphysics isn't just God, it is being qua being.
Meaning the study of existence purely as existence.
Yes, before it's categorized into physical things or numbers.
Okay, what's the second pole?
The ontological and henological pole. Once you establish that you're studying existence, you have to analyze its properties. This is where he rigorously defines potentiality versus actuality.
Building on Al-Farabi's unity and multiplicity.
Exactly.
And the third pole?
The theological pole. This is the culmination of the system. This is where he discusses the first principle God and details the exact mechanism of how the universe emanates from this absolute unity.
But the theoretical engine of his entire system, The concept that completely changed the course of human metaphysical thought is his distinction between essence and existence.
It is arguably Avicenna's most famous and consequential contribution.
I really want to spend a moment here because this mechanism is just brilliant.
He realized that for any created, contingent thing in the universe, its essence, its whatness, is fundamentally distinct from its existence, its thatness.
Okay, let's try to visualize this. Think about computer software. A programmer can write the code for a highly complex video game physics engine, right?
Okay, yeah.
They define the gravity, the friction, the way light bounces off surfaces. That code contains the total, complete essence of that digital world. If you read the code, you know exactly what it is.
But that code sitting in a text file doesn't actually exist as a functioning, moving world until someone hits compile and runs it through a CPU.
Exactly. The essence of the program does not guarantee its execution.
That is an excellent modern parallel. For all contingent things, which is literally everything in the universe, from a speck of dust to an angel existence is something added to their essence.
The definition of a horse does not contain the necessity of a horse actually existing in the real world.
Their essence is pure potential. They have to receive their existence from an external cause. The CPU has to run the code.
And if you trace that chain of causes back,
If you trace the chain of causes back, you cannot have an infinite regress of things giving existence to other things. You must eventually arrive at a necessary existent.
you must arrive at a being whose very essence is existence.
A being that cannot not exist, because existence isn't something added to it. Existence is what it is.
God.
God. This is Avicenna's famous metaphysical proof for God's existence, known as the proof of the truthful. God is the only reality where essence and existence are completely identical.
It is a towering, incredibly cohesive intellectual empire. He essentially proved God using pure ontology.
He did.
But an empire that big and that confident is going to attract challengers, and this is where we get the massive theological reaction.
Enter Al-Ghazali.
Al-Ghazali, who dies in 1111 and writes a book with one of the greatest titles in history, The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
It's a fantastic title. Al-Ghazali is a highly prominent Asharite theologian. And for a very long time, Western scholars pointed to the incoherence and said, look, here's the moment philosophy died. Al-Ghazali killed it.
But when you actually read the text, as the Handbook shows,
Yeah.
Al-Ghazali wasn't just some angry anti-intellectual theologian yelling at people to stop thinking.
Far from it. He was doing highly technical, incredibly sophisticated philosophical critiques. He beat them at their own game.
He absolutely did. Al-Ghazali realized that to refute Avicenna, you couldn't just quote scripture. You had to master Avicenna's system and break it from the inside.
In The Incoherence, he isolates 20 specific teachings of the philosophers. On 17 of them, he accuses them of religious innovation, but on 3 of them, he accuses them of outright unbelief.
And those are the big 3 we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Eternity of the world, God not knowing particulars, and the denial of bodily resurrection.
Exactly.
But the how of his argument is what really matters.
Yeah.
How does he attack the eternity of the world?
He uses their own Aristotelian standards of logic against them. For example, he attacks the philosophers' concept of causality.
Okay, how so?
Well, the philosophers argued that cause and effect are logically necessary, like fire must burn cotton, therefore an eternal God must eternally produce a universe.
So how does Al-Ghazali dismantle that?
He argues that there is no logical necessity connecting the fire and the burning cotton. We just observe them happening together out of habit.
Wait, so you're saying fire doesn't actually cause the burning?
Right. The only true cause is God's will, which can choose to create a universe at a specific moment in time or choose for fire not to burn. He is deploying highly sophisticated epistemology to defend traditional theology.
And the irony here is just beautiful. By writing The Incoherence to attack the philosophers, Al-Ghazali actually proved that you could use the rigorous tools of logic to defend theology.
So instead of destroying philosophy, he accidentally institutionalized it.
He forced it into the theology classrooms.
He fundamentally altered the curriculum. Once Al-Ghazali proved that logic was a neutral, powerful tool for defending the faith, theology and philosophy began to merge.
The Handbook highlights another figure from this era, Al-Sharastani, who dies in 1153. He wrote an Ismaili critique of Avicenna called The Wrestling Match with the Philosophers.
The wrestling match.
I love that. The madrasa didn't become a graveyard for philosophy, it became a wrestling ring.
By examining figures like Sharastani, we see that by the 12th century, the landscape had completely changed. Scholars were no longer divided into Greeks and Arabs. They were divided into pre-Avicennan and post-Avicennan.
Avicenna became the new standard.
The new Aristotle. The state-sponsored religious colleges, the madrasas, became absolute hotbeds of philosophical disputation. The terms of the debate were set by Avicenna, even when the goal was to refute him.
Okay, but while the Eastern Islamic world, places like Baghdad and Persia, was locked in this intense wrestling match with Avicenna, the Western Islamic world over in Andalusia, or Islamic Spain, was carving out an entirely new path.
Andalusia had a very distinct intellectual ecology.
The flavor of thought there was completely different.
And our sources point us to a truly remarkable figure here who exemplifies this, Ibn Tufayl. He dies in 1185, and he wrote this philosophical novel, Hay ibn Yaqzan.
This text is mind-blowing. It's basically a philosophical Robinson Crusoe, written centuries before Daniel Defoe. But instead of focusing on survival, it focuses on epistemology.
It is a brilliant narrative framing device. Hay ibn Yaqzan translates to alive, son of awake.
And what's the premise?
It's the story of a boy who grows up entirely alone on an uninhabited desert island near the equator. He's raised by a doe.
So he has no human language.
No society, no culture, no religion, and no prophets to teach him anything.
He is a completely blank slate, but purely through empirical observation of the natural world and by using his own innate human reason, this feral child manages to deduce the entire hierarchy of the cosmos.
The novel walks you through his developmental stages. First, he dissects the doe that raised him after she dies, trying to find the source of life.
Which leads him to understand the physical heart and vital spirit.
From there, he deduces the principles of physics, matter, and form. He observes the motions of the heavenly bodies, deduces the existence of an immaterial soul.
And eventually, he rationally proves the necessity of a transcendent creator.
Ibn Tufayl is making a massive claim here about human nature.
He's arguing that the human intellect, if it is functioning properly in observing nature, will naturally arrive at the exact same ultimate truths found in Revelation.
Reason and religion are parallel paths to the same summit, and he deliberately crafts the story so that the reader goes step by step with Hay, verifying his discoveries alongside him.
But what I found so surprising and honestly deeply moving was the ecological message embedded in the story. Once Hay deduces that God exists, how does that change his behavior on the island?
The text is very explicit about this. As Hay realizes that the entire universe is an emanation of God's bounty, he concludes that his own ultimate purpose is to emulate that benign divine influence.
So he doesn't see himself as the master of nature.
No, he sees himself as its caretaker. He imposes strict dietary limits on himself, eating only what he absolutely must to survive.
He tries not to wipe out any seed-bearing plants or animal lineages.
Exactly. He removes obstacles from the paths of animals. He waters plants that are dying. He sees the preservation of the natural world as a direct participation in the divine will.
It's a fully realized ecological philosophy based entirely on metaphysics. It's incredible.
It really is.
Now, you have to contrast this deeply individualistic, almost solitary approach to philosophy with another Andalusian giant who lived around the same time, Averroes, or Ibn Rushd.
Averroes takes a very different, much more legalistic approach to defending philosophy.
Right, because Averroes was a highly respected Maliki jurist, a religious judge.
As well as a philosopher and physician. So when he defends philosophy in his famous decisive treatise, he doesn't do it as a solitary mystic. He does it on the strict terms of Islamic jurisprudence.
He actually issues a fatwa, a legal ruling about philosophy.
He does. In the decisive treatise, he doesn't just argue that philosophy is permissible. He issues a legal ruling that the study of philosophy is actually obligatory for those who have the intellectual capacity for it.
Wait, obligatory? Like you have to do it?
Yes. He argues that the Quran repeatedly commands humans to reflect on the universe. And since demonstrative philosophy is the most rigorous method of reflection available, you are legally commanded by God to study it.
But that inevitably leads to the classic problem. What does a philosopher do when the logical conclusions of philosophy seem to violently clash with the literal text of the Quran?
Averroes introduces a rigorous rule for ta'wil, which means figurative or allegorical interpretation.
How does that work?
Averroes operates on the axiom that truth cannot contradict truth. Since demonstrative philosophy leads to undeniable truth and divine revelation is undeniable truth, they must fundamentally agree.
So if they appear to clash,
if the apparent literal meaning of Scripture contradicts a demonstrated philosophical truth, Averroes argues it simply means the scripture was never meant to be taken literally in that instance. It must be interpreted allegorically.
And who gets to do this interpretation?
Crucially, he argues that the philosopher, trained in logic, is the one uniquely qualified to perform this allegorical interpretation. The uneducated masses should stick to the literal meaning to avoid confusion.
Wow. Okay, so in the West, in Andalusia, you have Ibn Tufail's solitary island empiricist, and you have Averroes using the law to mandate Aristotelian logic.
But if we swing back over to the east, into Persia and the more mystical circles, we find yet another massive, paradigm-shifting alternative to Avicenna.
We find Suhrawardi.
Suhrawardi is a fascinating, tragic figure. He was executed in Aleppo in 1191 at the age of 38 due to theological controversies.
But in his short life, he founded an entirely new school of thought called Illuminationism.
The Handbook looks closely at his work, Intimations of the Tablet and the Throne. And if you look at Suhrawardi's motivations, he was deeply dissatisfied with the peripatetic approach.
The Aristotelian and Avicennan approach.
Right. He felt it was too dry, too reliant on abstract categorization. He wanted an approach that combined rigorous logical analysis with direct, intuitive, mystical experience.
And to achieve that, he completely tears down the foundational mechanics of Aristotelian physics. Specifically, he dismantles the idea of hylomorphism.
Let's define hylomorphism, because understanding what he is destroying is key to understanding what he builds.
Okay, what is it?
Hylomorphism is the Aristotelian doctrine that every physical thing in the universe is a composite of two principles, matter and form.
So matter is the pure potentiality, the raw stuff.
And form is the organizing principle that actualizes that matter into a specific thing. So the clay is the matter and the shape of the bowl is the form. Avicenna built his entire physical universe on this duality.
And Suhrawardi looks at this and says, no, that is completely wrong.
Yeah.
What does he replace matter and form with?
Light.
Just
Light. Suhrawardi constructs an entire ontology, an entire theory of being based exclusively on light and darkness, presence and absence. For him, the universe isn't made of dead matter interacting with abstract forms.
What is it then?
The universe is a single continuous spectrum of light emanating from the light of lights, which is God.
Wait, I need to visualize this. If he throws out matter and form, what is a physical object made of in his system?
Okay.
If I am holding a rock, is it just an illusion?
It is not an illusion, but it is a degree of intensity. Think of a light dimmer switch in your dining room.
Okay.
You can turn it up to a blinding glare or turn it down until the room is almost pitch black. Suhrawardi argues that things differ from one another not because they have different fundamental substances, but purely based on their degree of luminosity.
Their intensity of light.
Exactly. A rock is just a very, very dim, obfuscated degree of the exact same light that, at a much higher intensity, constitutes a human soul or an angel.
The underlying reality is identical. The only difference is the luminosity. That is a radically different way to visualize reality.
Instead of a universe of interacting mechanical parts, it's a universe of varying degrees of brightness.
But this isn't just a poetic metaphor for him, is it? It fundamentally changes how humans acquire knowledge.
Yes. This leads to his greatest epistemological innovation, the concept of knowledge by presence.
Let's compare that to Avicenna. In the Avicennan system, you know a tree by observing it, stripping away its physical accidents in your mind and extracting its abstract form.
Right. Knowledge is representational. You have a mental picture of the tree.
How does Suhrawardi change that?
Suhrawardi points out that you don't know yourself through an abstract mental picture. You know you exist because you are immediately, intimately present to yourself.
Like you don't have a concept of your own pain, you just feel the pain directly.
Exactly. Suhrawardi takes this direct, unmediated apprehension knowledge by presence and extends it.
To everything.
Because the universe is just a spectrum of light, and the human soul is a concentrated, immaterial light. If the soul purifies itself, it can directly apprehend the light of other entities without needing mental representations.
You can know the universe as intimately as you know your own existence.
It's a breathtaking system.
Okay, so by the time we hit the 13th century, the intellectual board is fully set. You have the Avicennan system dominating the madrasas, Andalusian naturalism in the West, and Illuminationism offering this luminous alternative.
Which brings us to what the Handbook identifies as perhaps the most tragically misunderstood era in all of intellectual history, the golden age of commentaries and margins.
We're talking about the period stretching roughly from the 13th all the way to the 18th centuries, and this is where that Western prejudice we discussed at the beginning really reared its head.
This is the part of the timeline where the Western historians drew the Dark Ages line. They looked at this period and saw that nobody was writing books with titles like My Grand New Theory of Everything.
Instead, everyone was writing a shar, which is a commentary, or a hashia, which is a super commentary.
Literally notes written in the margins of older books. And the assumption was, oh, they've run out of ideas. They're just writing pedantic summaries of Avicenna. No original thought is happening here.
But the handbook emphatically proves that this assumption is completely false. These commentaries and glosses were not summaries. They were highly dynamic vehicles for critical, innovative reflection.
If you're listening to this, you might share the exact skepticism those historians had. You might be thinking, if these scholars were so brilliant, why didn't they just write their own original books?
Yeah. Why spend your whole life writing notes in the margins of someone else's book?
It is entirely a matter of differing intellectual cultures. We have a very modern post-Enlightenment bias that equates originality with a blank page, a brand new title, and a complete rejection of the past.
But in the deep scholarly Islamic tradition, truth is viewed as collaborative.
Engaging with a master text via commentary is the ultimate way to show mastery of the tradition while incrementally pushing the boundaries of knowledge from within.
It's actually exactly how modern science works today. A quantum physicist today doesn't publish a book saying, here's my completely standalone brand new theory of gravity, unrelated to anything else.
No, they publish peer-reviewed papers that explicitly cite, build upon, tweak, and occasionally correct the existing paradigms of Einstein or Bohr.
Writing a gloss on a specific sentence of a foundational text was their version of publishing a highly focused, peer-reviewed scientific article.
That is the exact parallel. Let's look at the example of Fakhr al-Din al-Razi's commentary on Avicenna's Pointers and Reminders.
How does al-Razi approach the commentary? Does he just explain what Avicenna meant?
Not at all. Al-Razi acts as a fierce, hypercritical Asharite theologian. He uses the commentary format to practically dismantle Avicenna line by line, attacking the logical weak points of the system.
And this critique was so devastating that decades later, another titan, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, had to write his own commentary on al-Razi's commentary.
Specifically to defend Avicenna, patch the holes al-Razi found, and rebuild the philosophical system. The most cutting-edge debate in the world was happening in the commentary.
The margin is where the magic happened. The source text also gives us a fantastic example of this in the realm of logic, looking at a foundational textbook called the Shamsiyya, written by Katibi.
Yes. The Shamsiyya became the standard logic textbook in madrasas for centuries, and the Handbook examines a specific commentary written on it by a 14th century scholar named Tatani.
What does Tatani do?
He uses the commentary format to introduce highly complex logical distinctions that Katibi hadn't even considered in the original text.
Can you give an example of one of those distinctions?
Tatani rigorously distinguishes between reading logical propositions for their essence versus reading them for their external reality.
Okay, break that down for me. Why does that distinction matter?
Suppose I make the logical proposition. Every triangle has 3 interior angles. If you read that proposition for its external reality, you are making a claim about physical triangles drawn on paper or carved in wood in the real world.
Okay, but what if I read it for its essence?
If you read it for its essence, you are making a claim about the purely abstract scientific concept of triangularity, regardless of whether a single physical triangle currently exists in the universe.
Ah, I see.
Tatani argued that you have to categorize every logical argument based on whether the subject is an abstract essence or a concrete reality, otherwise your syllogisms will fall apart.
It is high-level semantic parsing. And this intense culture of marginalia wasn't just confined to the Arab world or Persia. It had massive global reach.
Absolutely. The Handbook tracks how these logical and philosophical systems spread deep into the Ottoman Empire and far into Mughal India. We look at a scholar in 18th century India named al-Bihari.
He wrote a highly influential logic textbook called the Silma Ulum. But what is he doing in India in the 1700s? Is he just memorizing Avicenna?
No, he is using this highly evolved logical framework to tackle incredibly sticky, universally recognized logical paradoxes.
Like the liar paradox.
Exactly. The statement, "this sentence is false." He also dives deep into the epistemological mechanism of the absolute unknown.
The absolute unknown. How do you logically analyze something you don't know?
That is exactly the paradox he addresses. How can you even form a judgment about something if it is absolutely unknown to you?
Because if you pass a judgment on it, even the judgment that It is unknown. You must have some mental conceptualization of it to point your judgment toward.
But the moment you conceptualize it, it is no longer absolutely unknown. Al-Bihari uses the technical vocabulary of the commentary tradition to resolve how the mind grasps concepts of non-existence.
These are rigorous analytic problems being hashed out in Indian madrasas right up to the dawn of the modern era.
Which conclusively proves the tradition is alive, kicking, and innovating.
But if logic and semantics dominated the Sunni schools in India and the Ottoman Empire, the Shia world in 17th century Safavid Iran was doing something entirely different.
They were building massive, mind-bending metaphysical systems from the ground up.
This is the period known as the Safavid metaphysical synthesis. The intellectual energy in Isfahan during this time was staggering.
And the pivotal figure who sets this synthesis in motion is Mir Damad, who dies in 1631.
Our sources note that Mir Damad was basically obsessed with solving one single monumental problem in his major work, Al-Qabasat.
Yes, the problem of the eternity of the cosmos.
As we discussed earlier with Al-Ghazali, this was the great heresy of the philosophers.
Avicenna had argued the universe is eternal. The theologians vehemently argued the universe had a definitive beginning in time. Mir Damad was desperate to solve this tension.
He wanted to maintain the philosophical purity of an unchanging God, but he also demanded a cosmos that was genuinely created.
Because if you're Mir Damad, you are looking at a massive logical wall. If God is completely perfect outside of time and unchanging, why would he suddenly decide to create a universe on a random Tuesday?
Right. A change in action implies a change in the agent, and God cannot change.
Precisely. The theologians' view implied God was subject to time. To solve this, Mir Damad introduces a highly original, highly complex mechanism called Huduth Dari.
Which translates roughly to perpetual creation or atemporal incipience.
Okay, I'm going to need you to explain the mechanism here. How does perpetual creation solve the problem between a timeless God and a changing universe?
Mir Damad solves it by dividing reality into three distinct receptacles of existence. First, you have Zaman, which is time. Time is the measure of changing things against other changing things.
The realm of the physical universe.
Right, the movement of the sun against the aging of a human body. Second, at the absolute top, you have Sarmad, which is eternity.
This is the realm of God and the divine attributes, the unchanging measured against the unchanging. No time exists here.
So how do the two interact? How does the unchanging Sarmad touch the changing Zama?
That is his brilliant invention. He introduces a buffer zone, a third receptacle called Dar, or perpetuity. Dar is the relation of the unchanging to the changing.
It acts like an umbilical cord.
Yes. Mir Damad argues that the universe does not have a beginning in historical time, Zaman, because time itself is just a feature of the physical universe.
However, the universe is constantly, perpetually being created by God in the realm of Dar.
Every single existent thing is preceded by non-existence in the realm of Dar. Therefore, the universe is genuinely created. It relies entirely on God pulling it out of non-existence, but it isn't created at a specific moment in time.
It satisfies the philosopher's demand for eternal emanation and the theologian's demand for a created cosmos.
It is a stunning intellectual compromise. It requires you to completely rewire how you think about causality and time.
But what's wild is that Mir Damad, despite this brilliance, is actually overshadowed by his own student, a man who becomes arguably the most famous philosopher of the later Islamic period, Mulla Sadra.
Mulla Sadra, who dies in 1635. His magnum opus is a massive multi-volume work called the Asfar, but our text focuses on a more accessible summary called the Divine Witnesses.
Mulla Sadra doesn't just offer a compromise, he initiates a complete metaphysical revolution. Let's break down his massive contribution. What mechanism does he change?
He completely inverts Avicenna. Remember Avicenna's crucial distinction between essence and existence, the blueprint versus the actual building?
Yeah.
In the centuries following Avicenna, a massive debate raged. Which of the two is the fundamental concrete reality?
What were the two sides?
Most illuminationist thinkers following Suhrawardi argued for the primacy of essence. They argued that the universe is made of diverse, concrete essences, hoarseness, treeness, humanity.
And existence is just a secondary, abstract mental concept that we attach to these essences when we notice them in the world.
But Sadra flips it. He executes a total reversal. Sadra argues for Asalat al-Wujud, the primacy of existence.
Meaning existence is the only true, concrete, fundamental reality.
Essences are the illusions. Essences are just mental abstractions. They are merely the conceptual boundaries or limits of existence.
Okay, I am struggling with this a bit. How can a tree be just a boundary of existence?
Think back to Suhrawardi's light dimmer switch. Sadra takes that exact concept but replaces the word light with the word existence. Existence itself is a single, continuous, graded reality.
It flows through everything.
It ranges from the infinite, blinding, limitless intensity of God's existence, cascading all the way down to the weakest, dimmest existence of a grain of sand. The essence of the sand isn't a real thing, it's just the shape that existence takes when it is at that specific low level of intensity.
So the universe is just one giant ocean of existence vibrating at different frequencies.
That is a very accurate way to view it. And establishing the primacy of existence allows Sadra to solve incredibly difficult problems. Because existence is dynamic and constantly intensifying, he introduces the mechanism of substantial motion.
He argues that the substance of the universe is constantly in motion, constantly evolving to higher degrees of existence. And he uses this mechanism of substantial motion to solve the problem of bodily resurrection, doesn't he?
Yes, the exact heresy Avicenna was accused of. Sadra argues that the human soul begins as a purely physical thing, the dim existence of the bodily embryo.
But through substantial motion, through living and experiencing, the soul's existence intensifies until it becomes completely immaterial and spiritual.
Therefore, in the afterlife, the soul has so much existential power that it actually creates its own spiritual body from within itself, through the power of its imagination. He brilliantly bridges the gap between physics, metaphysics, and Islamic eschatology.
It is a staggering, all-encompassing synthesis. So by the 17th century, the tradition is producing these world-historic metaphysical frameworks. Which brings us to the final stretch of our journey, the modern encounters.
As we enter the 19th and 20th centuries, this deeply rooted, highly developed tradition doesn't just fade away. It collides head-on with modern Western science, physics, and analytic philosophy.
And again, the tradition doesn't crumble, and it doesn't retreat into rigid dogmatism. It actively engages. The Handbook highlights Khairabadi in 19th century India.
Fadli Haq Khairabadi, who died in 1861 in an East India Company prison. Before his imprisonment, he wrote a text that represents the absolute peak systematization of traditional Islamic natural philosophy.
What is he doing in that text?
He takes the entire Avicennan physics tradition, strips away centuries of dead ends, and creates a highly elegant, perfectly economical textbook. It shows the internal perfection of the older Aristotelian paradigm right on the eve of its collision with Newtonian physics.
But for the actual direct collision with modern physics, we look to the Ottoman Empire, to a scholar named Ali Sadat Bey, who dies in 1900. I find his approach incredibly clever because he doesn't reject modern science, he absorbs it.
Yes, his book is called Principles of Transformation in the Motion of Particles. Ali Sadat Bey looked at cutting-edge 19th century scientific concepts, specifically thermodynamics, the conservation of energy, and atomic force.
And instead of viewing them as a threat to religion, he provided an occasionalist interpretation of them.
We need to explain occasionalism to understand his mechanism. Occasionalism is the classical Islamic theological idea that God is the only true cause in the universe.
Fire doesn't cause cotton to burn. God creates the fire, and then God directly creates the burning in the cotton. Cause and effect in nature is just a habit established by God, a frame-by-frame rendering of reality.
Exactly. It's a continuous, microscopic divine intervention. Now, when Western physicists started talking about thermodynamics, they argued that invisible forces, or energy, were what caused atoms to move.
Ali Sadat Bey read this and essentially said, yes, exactly. You Western scientists have just discovered occasionalism.
He argues that energy is just the scientific label for God's continuous action.
Precisely. He argues that since modern physics cannot empirically observe force itself, it can only observe the effects of the force. Force is just a nominal label. It is just a placeholder word for the direct, continuous, occasion-by-occasion creative act of God.
He seamlessly integrated the empirical findings of thermodynamics with classical Islamic occasionalist theology.
It is brilliant. Then you have Muhammad Iqbal, writing in British India in the 1930s. He is widely famous as a poet, but his book, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, is an absolute philosophical powerhouse.
Iqbal is unique because he is equally deeply comfortable with the classical Islamic tradition and with modern Western philosophy.
He isn't just summarizing the past. He is directly engaging with Immanuel Kant, Henri Bergson, and Albert Einstein. But he places them in a direct dialogue with Al-Ghazali and Rumi.
What is his ultimate goal? What is the reconstruction he is aiming for?
He is demanding a scientific, empirical form of religious knowledge. He believes that the inner spiritual intuitive experience of religion must be subjected to a rigorous philosophical test.
He uses Bergson's theories of time and Einstein's relativity to argue that the universe is dynamic, process-oriented, and constantly expanding. He then shows that this modern scientific view is entirely in harmony with the dynamic creative spirit of the Quran.
But the collision wasn't just with physics and thermodynamics, it was also with Western analytic philosophy and the very foundations of epistemology. And this brings us back to the hook of our show, Mohammed Bakir al-Sadr in Iraq.
Al-Sadr is a towering intellectual figure, executed by Saddam Hussein in 1980. In his massive work on the logical foundations of induction, he attempts to solve a problem that has plagued Western philosophy since the 18th century, David Hume's problem of induction.
For our listeners, let's quickly summarize why Hume's problem is so terrifying. Hume pointed out that just because you have observed the sun rising every single day of your life, there's no logical guarantee that it will rise tomorrow.
You cannot logically prove that the future will resemble the past based purely on observing repeated instances. It's the problem of induction, and it technically threatens the foundational validity of the entire scientific method.
And al-Sadr tries to solve this massive epistemological hole using probability calculus.
What is the mechanism there? How does math solve Hume?
Al-Sadr argues that when we observe a phenomenon repeatedly, like water boiling at 100 degrees, we assign a fractional probability to the hypothesis that this is a universal law.
Every time we observe it happen again, the probability of alternative hypotheses decreases.
Al-Sadr uses complex probability calculus to demonstrate how these fractional probabilities multiply against each other until the alternative hypotheses mathematically approach zero. At that point, the human mind achieves a state of subjective certainty that perfectly maps onto objective reality.
He mathematically proves that the scientific method works.
Yes, and then he takes it a step further. He applies the exact same probability calculus to the design of the universe. He argues that the probability of the universe's order being a random coincidence approaches zero,
allowing us to arrive at absolute scientific certainty about the existence of God as the designer. And what is most remarkable is that he fights this battle entirely on the terrain of modern analytic philosophy.
And he isn't the only traditional cleric fighting these epistemological battles in the 20th century. The source text also highlights Allama Tabatabai in Iran, who died in 1981.
Tabatabai saw that the real threat to faith in the modern world wasn't just physical science, it was ideological. The threats were skepticism, materialism, and Marxism.
He realized that the traditional Shi'i seminary curriculum needed a massive epistemological upgrade. So he wrote Nihayat al-Hikmah, which became a foundational philosophy textbook.
He used it to combat modern skepticism by embedding a rigorous, realist epistemology into the minds of seminary students. He drew heavily upon Mullah Sadra's primacy of existence to defend the absolute, concrete reality of the world against the reductionist, materialistic claims of Marxism.
He was arming theologians with metaphysics. And finally, to show just how incredibly diverse the 20th century landscape is, we have a figure like Zaki Najib Mahmoud in Egypt, who takes a completely different, almost opposing route to Tabatabai.
Mahmoud, who dies in 1993, represents the secular, analytic branch of this modern engagement. He wrote a highly influential book called Toward a Scientific Philosophy. Unlike al-Sadr or Tabatabai, who were defending metaphysics, Mahmoud actually fully embraced logical positivism.
Logical positivism being the strict Western philosophical movement that claims any statement that cannot be empirically verified through the senses or isn't true by strict logical definition is literally meaningless noise.
Precisely. Mahmoud argued that the Arab world needed to awaken from its dogmatic slumber by adopting the strictly scientific empiricist philosophy. He essentially dismissed a massive portion of traditional Islamic metaphysics as meaningless speculation.
He wanted philosophy to act purely as the logical analysis of scientific language. It just shows that the conversation never stopped. It splintered, it diversified, it debated with itself, and it engaged deeply with Einstein, with Hume, with Kant, and with logical positivism.
So as we wrap up this massive deep dive, let's take a breath and recap the sheer scale of the journey we've been on.
We have traveled from 9th century Baghdad, where Al-Kindi was inventing Arabic terminology, to convince his peers that Greek metaphysics and the Quran were saying the same thing.
We walked through the towering structural empire of Avicenna's logic and watched Al-Ghazali weaponize that very logic to force philosophy into the theology classrooms.
We saw Ibn Tufail's feral child deducing the entire cosmos on a desert island. and Suhrawardi completely reimagining the physical universe as a hierarchy of pure light.
We witnessed the fierce, brilliant debates happening in the margins of commentaries in India and the Ottoman Empire. And we tracked the tradition as it collided with modern physics, probability theory, and Western analytic philosophy in the 20th century.
The ultimate takeaway from the handbook, the synthesis of all this material, is that human inquiry simply refuses to be boxed in.
The history of Islamic philosophy proves that when rational inquiry was stigmatized and chased out of one terminology, it didn't die. It found refuge and thrived in theology.
When it was restricted by the format of standalone books, it innovated and pushed boundaries in the margins of commentaries.
It successfully integrated Greek logic, confronted modern physics, and tackled analytic epistemology on its own terms. It proves that faith and rigorous reason have been in a continuous, dynamic, and highly productive dialogue for well over a millennium.
The tradition did not die in the 12th century. It adapted, it lived, and it breathed, which leaves you with a final, provocative thought to ponder as you step back into the modern world.
We've seen how Islamic philosophy survived and thrived by constantly absorbing and adapting to new paradigms, from Aristotelian metaphysics to Newtonian physics, from Galenic medicine to modern probability theory.
So, what will the Islamic philosophers of tomorrow do with the massive paradigms of our current era? How will this thousand-year-old tradition of intense logical and metaphysical scrutiny engage with the concept of artificial intelligence?
How will it categorize digital consciousness or reconcile Melissadra's primacy of existence with the weird, probabilistic realities of quantum mechanics?
The tradition hasn't ended. The ink isn't dry. The philosophical engine built by Avicenna, refined by Al-Ghazali, and revolutionized by Sadra is just waiting for the next commentary to be written in the margins of our modern world.
Because history isn't a neat architectural blueprint with clean lines and binary eras. It's a messy, continuous, brilliant conversation in the margins.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and keep exploring.